picture the desert at twilight. The sun descends below dunes that ripple like frozen waves, casting shadows long enough to swallow entire valleys. The air cools. Silence settles, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of patient waiting. Above, the first stars puncture the deepening blue, ancient light traveling across unimaginable distances to meet this moment, this place, this grain of sand beneath your fingertips. The wind moves differently here. It doesn't howl or rage. It whispers. And if you truly listen, the whispers carry something older than language. They carry memory. Beneath these sands lie the remnants of worlds we've forgotten. Cities that rose and fell before history learned to write its own name. Rivers that carved their paths through stone when the Sahara bloomed green. Peoples who gazed at these same stars and wondered, as we do now, what mysteries pulse in the darkness between constellations. Time moves strangely in places like this. 1,000 years becomes indistinguishable from 10,000. The dunes shift and reshape themselves with each storm, burying one story while revealing another. What was lost yesterday may resurface tomorrow. What seems permanent today may vanish by next season. The stones remember, even when we don't. They hold impressions of ancient seas, the footprints of creatures that walked when the world was young, the tool marks of hands that shaped them with purpose and precision. Every rock is a witness. Every cliff face, a chronicle written in layers of sediment and time. As darkness completes its conquest of the sky, the Milky Way emerges a river of light flowing overhead, mirroring rivers that once flowed below. The ancients saw connections we've forgotten. They understood that the earth and sky were not separate realms, but two halves of a single breathing cosmos. Tonight, we embark on a journey through deep time. Not the shallow pools of recorded history, but the vast ocean that stretches back before pyramids, before writing, before the first seed was deliberately planted in prepared soil. We'll walk among ruins that predate the oldest myths. We'll listen to stories carved in stone and encrypted in star positions. We'll contemplate the possibility that our understanding of the past is not incomplete, it's barely begun. The desert waits, the stars watch, and somewhere in the space between sand and sky, the ancient worlds sleep, dreaming of the day they might be remembered once more. Long before kings commissioned scribes, before temples touched the clouds, before anyone thought to mark the passage of seasons on stone or clay, humans moved through the world with a different kind of knowledge. They read landscapes the way we read books. They navigated by stars, wind, and the behavior of animals. Their history lived in stories passed from elder to child, in songs that encoded survival information, in dances that mapped territorial boundaries and water sources. The mainstream narrative of our emergence begins modestly. Small bands of hunter-gatherers, perhaps 20 to 50 individuals, moving seasonally through territories they knew with intimate precision. They carried everything they owned. They left little behind: some tools, some bones, occasionally a burial that speaks across millennia of grief that still feels familiar. Gradually, incrementally, over spans of time that make empires seem like mayflies, things changed. In the Fertile Crescent, where the Tigris and Euphrates carved green corridors through arid lands, people began to linger. Wild grasses grew thick enough to harvest. Animals congregated at reliable water sources. The advantages of staying outweighed the risks of moving on. The first settlements were humble. Circular huts made from whatever materials the landscape provided: reeds, mud, stones, branches. These villages often had no more than a few dozen inhabitants, but they represented a fundamental shift in human consciousness. For the first time, people invested labor in places rather than in portable knowledge. They dug storage pits. They built more permanent shelters. They began accumulating possessions beyond what could be carried. Along the Nile, a similar pattern emerged. Each summer, like clockwork, the great river swelled with meltwater from distant mountains, overflowing its banks and depositing rich silt across the floodplain. People learned to plant in the mud, harvest before the next flood, and trust in the river's rhythmic generosity. Communities formed along these predictable shores, first temporary camps, then permanent villages, eventually something approaching towns. In the Indus Valley, along the Yellow River, in the highlands of Anatolia, parallel processes unfolded. Humans were discovering that certain environments rewarded those who stayed, who learned their patterns, who invested seasons rather than days into understanding a single place. With settlement came specialization. Not everyone needed to hunt or gather anymore. Some people could focus on crafting better tools. Others could develop expertise in predicting floods, reading weather, treating illness. Knowledge began to accumulate and stratify. Elders became repositories of technical expertise that took decades to master. Social complexity followed. Decisions about resource distribution, conflict resolution, and cooperation with neighboring groups required new forms of organization. Leaders emerged sometimes through charisma, sometimes through heredity, sometimes through demonstrated competence. The first hierarchies formed, subtle at first, then increasingly pronounced. This is the orthodox story, supported by decades of careful archaeology. Pottery sequences, stratigraphy, carbon dating, settlement patterns. It's a story of gradual, understandable human adaptation to environmental opportunities. It's a story that makes sense, but it's also, perhaps, incomplete. Beneath the accepted narrative, whispers of something else have always persisted. Not in the mainstream journals or university textbooks, but in the field notes of puzzled archaeologists, in the oral traditions of desert peoples, in the anomalies that don't quite fit the timeline. Consider the Sahara itself, that vast ocean of sand and stone stretching across the width of Africa. Standard geology tells us it dried out gradually over millennia, reaching its current hyperarid state relatively recently in geological terms. But what if, during its green periods, civilizations arose that we've never properly reckoned with? Cultures that flourished when lakes dotted the landscape, when rivers carved deep channels through rock, when forests grew where now only wind-sculpted stone remains? The evidence, when you look with sideways eyes, is tantalizing. Satellite imagery reveals Ghost River's ancient watercourses buried beneath sand, visible only to radar that penetrates the surface. These rivers weren't small streams. They were massive systems, comparable to the Nile, suggesting ecosystems and populations of equivalent scale. Rock art scattered across the Sahara depicts scenes impossible in the current climate: hippos, giraffes, elephants, people swimming in waters that no longer exist. The art itself presents mysteries. Some images show remarkable sophistication, an artistic confidence suggesting long traditions of cultural development. Others depict figures and symbols whose meanings remain entirely opaque. In southern Egypt, west of the Nile, megalithic arrangements predate the dynastic period by thousands of years. Nabta Playa features stone circles aligned with star positions, suggesting astronomical knowledge and social organization sufficient to mobilize communal labor for non-utilitarian projects. Who were these people? The standard narrative suggests simple pastoralists with impressive observational skills. But the precision of the alignments, the scale of the effort, hints at something more structured, more sophisticated than scattered nomads should theoretically possess. Deeper still, quite literally, are the discoveries emerging from beneath modern cities and agricultural lands. Ground-penetrating radar and satellite archaeology reveal buried structures, settlement patterns, architectural features that exist below what was thought to be bedrock cultural layer. Each one pushes the timeline back, complicates the narrative, suggests that what we consider ancient may itself rest upon foundations older still. The Mediterranean coast presents similar puzzles. Underwater archaeologists occasionally stumble upon worked stone at depths corresponding to sea levels from the last ice age. These aren't natural formations. They're quarried blocks, aligned structures, harbors that served coastlines now drowned beneath meters of water. Most remain uninvestigated, too deep, too difficult, too expensive to study properly. Some researchers operating at the edges of academic respectability propose that these hints point toward civilizations that rose and fell in the gaps of our knowledge. Not continent-spanning empires, perhaps, but regional cultures with their own sophistications, their own achievements, their own tragedies. Cultures that left traces too subtle for traditional archaeology, but too persistent to entirely ignore. The mainstream pushes back, understandably. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and much of what exists remains circumstantial, suggestive, rather than conclusive, intriguing, rather than definitive. Yet the whispers continue. Each decade brings new discoveries that push cultural complexity earlier, that reveals surprising sophistication in supposedly primitive contexts. Perhaps we've been asking the wrong questions. Perhaps the story of human development isn't a simple arrow pointing from simple to complex, from scattered to settled, from ignorant to enlightened. Perhaps it's messier, a story of rises and collapses, of knowledge gained and lost, of civilizations that bloomed and withered in regions we now consider marginal or empty. The Desert Keeps in 1954, archaeologists working near the Great Pyramid of Khufu made an unexpected discovery. Sealed in a pit carved into bedrock, buried beneath precisely fitted limestone blocks, they found a ship. Not the remains of a ship, an actual, intact, full-sized vessel, disassembled but complete. Every plank and rope carefully preserved in the dry darkness. The ship was massive, over 40 meters long, made from Lebanese cedar, with a capacity to carry significant cargo or passengers. It had clearly been built with sophisticated understanding of naval architecture. The mortise and tenon joints showed expert craftsmanship. The hull design suggested seaworthiness for open water navigation. But here's what makes it strange. The ship was found thousands of meters from the nearest navigable water. The Nile, at its closest, was still a considerable distance away. And this wasn't some symbolic model or artistic representation. This was a functioning vessel, buried with apparent ceremony in the desert. The orthodox explanation suggests ceremonial purpose, a solar bark meant to carry the pharaoh's soul across celestial waters in the afterlife. The Egyptians, after all, were deeply invested in the journey beyond death. Providing transportation made symbolic sense. Yet something about the explanation doesn't quite settle. The ship showed signs of having been used. Salt deposits suggested exposure to seawater, not just river water. Wear patterns indicated real voyages, not just ritual display. Whatever this vessel's ultimate purpose, it had sailed somewhere before being disassembled and buried. Other desert ships have emerged over the decades. Some in Egypt, others scattered across arid regions of the Middle East and North Africa. Each discovery prompts the same questions. Why here? Why buried? What waters did they navigate before the desert claimed them? The landscape remembers differently than we do. What seems impossible now, a ship in a desert, may simply reflect how profoundly environments transform over time. Rivers dry up, lakes evaporate, coastlines retreat. What was once a thriving port can become, within a handful of centuries, nothing but sand and wind. The ship sleeps in its museum now, reconstructed, displayed, explained. But the questions linger like ghosts in its cedar timbers. What distant shores did it visit? What cargo did it carry? What did the builders know about the world that we've forgotten? Some answers are found. Others remain buried, waiting for the right question, the right moment, the right shifting of sand to reveal what lies beneath. Its secrets well, but it doesn't keep them forever. The Sahara hasn't always been a desert. This isn't speculation. It's established geological fact, confirmed by multiple independent lines of evidence. Sediment cores, fossil records, chemical analysis of rock formations, satellite imagery, all tell the same story. The Great Desert cycles between arid and humid phases, transforming over periods of roughly 20,000 years, from hyperarid wasteland to savanna-like landscape and back again. The mechanism driving these cycles is surprisingly straightforward. Earth as axial precession, the slow wobble in our planet's rotational axis, alters the distribution of solar radiation across latitudes. When northern hemisphere summers receive more intense sunlight, the African monsoon strengthens. Increased moisture penetrates deeper into the continent. Rainfall patterns shift northward. The desert blooms. During these humid phases, the Sahara transforms almost beyond recognition. Where now only scorpions and drought-adapted plants survive, vast river systems once flowed. Lake Mega Chad, in the continent's heart, swelled to rival the Caspian Sea in size. Satellite radar has mapped the buried courses of countless tributaries, feeding this vanished inland sea rivers that carved channels through bedrock, creating networks that would have supported extensive ecosystems. Paleontological evidence confirms what the hydrology suggests. Hippopotamus bones emerge from strata beneath current desert surfaces. Crocodile fossils lie entombed in sandstone. Fish species that require permanent, flowing water left their remains in locations now hundreds of kilometers from any moisture. Pollen cores reveal oak forests, grasslands, wetland vegetation, entire biomes that thrived where nothing grows today. The last major humid phase known to geologists as the African humid period peaked between roughly 11,000 and 5,000 years ago. This wasn't some brief wet spell. For 6,000 years, much of North Africa remained habitable, even hospitable. Rainfall, while not abundant by equatorial standards, fell reliably enough to support perennial vegetation. Seasonal monsoons brought predictable moisture. Rivers maintained year-round flow. Humans responded to this opportunity. The archaeological record from this period shows intensive occupation of regions now utterly barren. Rock art galleries document fishing, hunting of now extinct megafauna, cattle herding, communal gatherings. Settlements clustered around permanent water sources. Tool traditions show increasing sophistication, specialization, regional variation, all markers of stable, growing populations. Then, beginning around 5,000 years ago, the rains began to fail. Not suddenly, the process took centuries, but inexorably. The monsoon retreated southward. Lake levels dropped. Rivers diminished to seasonal flows, then to dry wadis that only ran after rare storms. Vegetation withered. Animals migrated or died. Human populations faced a choice: adapt, migrate, or perish. Most migrated, retreating to regions where water remained reliable. The Nile Valley absorbed refugees from the desiccating interior, swelling its population and quite possibly accelerating the social complexity that would eventually crystallize into pharaonic civilization. Similar population concentrations occurred around other remaining water sources: oases, highland regions, coastal areas where sea breezes brought moisture. But not everyone left. Some populations adapted to increasing aridity, developing nomadic pastoral strategies that could exploit diminishing resources. Others may have persisted around shrinking lakes and springs, watching their world transform around them, passing down memories of greener times and stories that would eventually become myth. The physical evidence of their presence remains, scattered across the desert, like breadcrumbs through deep time. Stone tools, pottery shards, hearthstones, burial sites. And beneath the sand, waiting to be discovered, the remnants of whatever cultural achievements these Green Sahara civilizations accomplished before the desert swallowed their world. The question isn't whether sophisticated societies existed during the humid periods. The question is how sophisticated, how organized, how culturally complex they became during those 6,000 years of opportunity, and whether anything of their knowledge, their innovations, their understanding survived the great drawing to be inherited by the cultures that came after. Imagine a Sahara bursting with life, not the hostile expanse of burning sand and lethal sun we know today, but a landscape of waving grasslands, scattered acacia groves, seasonal wetlands teeming with birds. Imagine rivers flowing year-round, connecting chains of lakes that glittered across the continental interior like scattered mirrors reflecting the sky. In this vanished world, people thrived, not just survived, thrived. The rock art they left behind suggests communities with leisure time, artistic traditions, cultural continuity spanning generations. The images they painted and carved onto cliff faces document social gatherings, ritual dances, elaborate hunts involving dozens of participants working in coordination. These aren't the productions of scattered, struggling nomads. These are the expressions of confident cultures with established patterns and shared symbolic languages. Consider Nabta Playa again, but with deeper attention. This wasn't a temporary camp. The stone circles there required significant labor to construct quarrying, transporting, positioning megaliths weighing several tons each. The astronomical alignments weren't accidents. They demonstrate sustained observation, mathematical understanding, and the social organization necessary to translate celestial knowledge into monumental form. Who directed this work? The standard narrative resists suggesting leadership hierarchies, preferring models of egalitarian cooperation. But megalithic construction almost always correlates with some form of social stratification: priests, chiefs, councils, someone or some group with authority to envision large projects and mobilize labor for their completion. If Green Sahara societies built stone circles aligned to solstices and star positions, they likely possessed corresponding social structures. Recent discoveries deepen the mystery. Pottery from this period shows surprising sophistication, not crude, utilitarian vessels, but decorated ceramics with consistent styles across wide geographic regions. This suggests communication networks, trade routes, shared aesthetic traditions. The clay sources analyzed in labs reveal that pots moved hundreds of kilometers from their origin points, implying either extensive trade networks or seasonal population movements on impressive scales. Stone tools from the period exhibit regional variations, different cultures developing different solutions to similar problems. In some areas, blade technologies dominate. In others, bifacial points. Certain regions show evidence of heat treatment technologies to improve stone workability. The diversity suggests not a single monolithic culture, but rather a mosaic of distinct societies, each adapting to local conditions while participating in broader networks of exchange and influence. Some researchers, pushing beyond conventional boundaries, propose even more provocative scenarios. What if some Green Sahara societies developed proto-urban centers? Places where populations concentrated around particularly reliable water sources, where specialization could flourish, where monumental architecture could rise. The evidence remains circumstantial geophysical anomalies, suggesting buried structures, erosion patterns inconsistent with natural processes, oral traditions among modern Saharan peoples describing cities swallowed by sand. Mainstream archaeology dismisses most such proposals as premature. The burden of proof lies with those making claims, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Yet each decade brings discoveries that wouldn't have been believed the decade before. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, a massive temple complex built by supposedly simple hunter-gatherers 11,000 years ago, reminded the field that human cultural complexity can emerge far earlier and in far different contexts than theories predict. Perhaps Green Sahara cultures achieved comparable sophistication. Perhaps in regions now buried under meters of sand lie the remains of settled communities, ceremonial centers, proto-cities that flourished for centuries before the rains failed. Perhaps they developed agricultural systems adapted to seasonal flooding, artistic traditions of painting and sculpture, astronomical knowledge encoded in landscape features we haven't yet learned to read. Or perhaps the truth is more modest villages and camps, impressive in their own right, but not urban, sophisticated without being civilizational in the sense we usually employ that term. Even this more conservative interpretation suggests complex societies with rich cultural lives during the 6,000 years when the Sahara bloomed. Either way, they're gone now. The desert reclaimed their territories with geological indifference. The lakes dried to salt pans. The rivers became fossils traced in stone. The people dispersed, carrying whatever they could, stories, certainly, and perhaps knowledge that would resurface in different contexts, attributed to different origins, no longer recognizable as inheritance from the Green Sahara. But the art remains, and the megaliths, and the buried traces waiting beneath sand for technologies capable of seeing through stone in time. The Green Sahara civilizations may be lost, but they're not erased. Not entirely. Not yet. Across the world, in regions supposedly isolated from one another, a curious pattern emerges. Long before recorded history, before writing systems or bronze tools, people were building with stone on scales that still impress. Not simple shelters or cairns, but massive constructions requiring vision, planning, coordinated labor, and sophisticated understanding of engineering principles. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey stands as perhaps the most dramatic challenge to orthodox timelines. Dated to approximately 9600 BCE, 11,000 years ago, this site features massive, T-shaped pillars arranged in circular formations, each pillar weighing multiple tons, many decorated with intricate bas-relief carvings of animals, abstract symbols, and enigmatic figures. The construction predates pottery, predates agriculture, predates everything we thought necessary for monumental architecture. The implications disturb comfortable narratives. Who built Göbekli Tepe? Supposedly nomadic hunter-gatherers without permanent settlements. How did they quarry, transport, and erect megaliths weighing up to 16 tons without metal tools, without draft animals, without wheels? How did they coordinate labor forces large enough to complete such projects? And perhaps most puzzling, why? What purpose did these stone circles serve that justified such extraordinary effort? The site's excavator proposed a radical answer: religion. Perhaps the first temples came before the first cities, not after. Perhaps the need to gather for ritual, to honor gods or ancestors or cosmic forces, drove people to cooperate on scales previously thought impossible without agricultural surplus and settled civilization. Perhaps the sacred preceded the secular in human cultural development. But Göbekli Tepe isn't unique. It's merely the most dramatic example of a global phenomenon. In Britain, Avebury and Stonehenge demonstrate comparable engineering sophistication thousands of years later, but still well before written records. The builders transported stones weighing 25 tons across distances exceeding 200 kilometers. They shaped them with precision, erected them in complex patterns aligned to celestial events, maintained these sites for centuries. In Malta, temple complexes dated to 3600 BCE feature megalithic construction so precise that modern machinery can barely improve upon it. Interior chambers employ corbelled roofs that have remained stable for 5 millennia. The structures show clear architectural evolution, early forms being crude, later forms increasingly refined, suggesting continuous cultural development over centuries. Across the Pacific, Easter Island's Moai statues represent another tradition of megalithic construction by supposedly primitive peoples. The largest statue ever erected weighed 82 tons and stood 10 meters high. The quarry where they were carved contains hundreds more in various states of completion, implying sustained effort over generations. How the islanders transported them, erected them, and balanced distinctive top-knot stones on their heads remains partially mysterious, despite decades of experimental archaeology. Even in the Americas, pre-Columbian cultures were moving and shaping stones with techniques we don't fully understand. At Ollantaytambo in Peru, megalithic blocks weighing over 50 tons were fitted together with such precision that mortar wasn't in necessary stones, rest purely on their own weight and perfect shaping. At Puma Punku in Bolivia, andesite blocks show evidence of machine-like precision cutting, complex joinery, and sophisticated understanding of geometry. The mainstream explanation for all these sites invokes clever use of simple technologies, levers, rollers, sledges, ramps, human labor in impressive quantities. And certainly these factors played roles. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that megaliths can be moved with primitive technologies, given sufficient people, time, and determination. Yet something nags at this explanation. Not the possibility of moving stones, that's clearly achievable, but the consistency of the impulse. Why did cultures separated by oceans and millennia all develop traditions of megalithic construction? Why invest such enormous labor in non-utilitarian projects? And more mysteriously, do similarities in construction techniques imply independent development of similar solutions? Or might there have been some form of diffusion, some shared inheritance from older traditions now lost? Some researchers propose controversial theories of prehistoric global seafaring, ancient trade networks, or even shared inheritance from a hypothetical earlier civilization that seeded knowledge across regions before disappearing from history. The mainstream dismisses most such proposals as insufficiently supported by evidence. Independent development of similar solutions to similar challenges seems more parsimonious than invoking mysterious vanished civilizations. Still, the question persists. What exactly were these silent builders trying to achieve? Were the megaliths purely ceremonial temples and tombs and ritual centers? Or did they serve additional purposes we no longer recognize: astronomical observatories, territorial markers, educational facilities, archives of encoded knowledge preserved in stone, because stone endures when all else crumbles? We'll likely never know completely. The builders left no written explanations. Their oral traditions died with them or transformed beyond recognition through countless retellings. We're left with the stones themselves mute, massive, precisely placed, aligned to cosmic events we still observe, but perhaps no longer understand with the same meaning. The silent builders speak through their works. We simply haven't learned their language yet. In a cave in southern Germany, deep within sediments dated to 40,000 years ago, archaeologists discovered an object that shouldn't exist according to previous understanding of human cultural evolution. Carved from the radius bone of a griffin vulture, perforated with precisely placed holes, it was immediately recognizable despite its age. A flute. Not a symbolic representation of a flute. Not something that vaguely resembled a flute. An actual functional musical instrument, carefully crafted with clear understanding of acoustic principles. When modern flutists blow into it using proper technique, it produces clear, melodious notes spanning an octave. The implications are profound. 40,000 years ago, during the height of the last ice age, when Neanderthals still roamed Europe and modern humans were relatively recent arrivals to the continent, someone sat down with a bone, a sharp stone tool, and intimate knowledge of music theory. They measured distances between holes to produce specific intervals. They shaped the mouthpiece to optimize airflow. They created not just a tool or weapon or utilitarian object, but something purely for beauty, for art, for the expression of emotions beyond survival. This wasn't humanity's first music, certainly. The archaeological record preserves only what survives: stone, bone, occasionally wood in extraordinary circumstances. Drums made from hollowed logs, rattles fashioned from gourds, stringed instruments using sinew and woodall would have decomposed millennia ago. The flute survives only because bone endures when buried in cave sediments with particular chemical properties. But it testifies to something essential about human consciousness. For 40,000 years minimum, we've been making music, singing songs, creating rhythms, fashioning instruments that extend our vocal range and emotional expression. Music isn't a recent cultural innovation or civilizational achievement. It's fundamental, perhaps universal, a defining characteristic of what makes us human. Think about what this means. The person who carved that flute, let's imagine her hands, weathered from Ice Age survival, carefully marking distances with scratches before boring through bone, lived a life we can barely imagine. She hunted megafauna. She processed hides with stone scrapers. She knew cold that would kill unprotected skin in hours. She lived in a world populated by predators, rivals, and dangers we've long since eliminated or domesticated. Yet she also knew beauty. She understood harmony. She possessed knowledge of scales and intervals that we categorize as music theory, but which she probably experienced as intuitive relationship between sounds. She created something that brought pleasure, not just to herself, but to her community. A gift of sound, of shared experience, of collective emotion, made tangible through vibrating air. The flute suggests other losses, other arts and skills and knowledge systems that left no trace. If musical instruments survived in certain conditions, what didn't survive? Oral traditions encoding historical memory, ecological knowledge, astronomical observations all vanished because they weren't written, weren't carved in stone, weren't accidentally preserved by favorable chemistry. Every culture develops creative expressions. Every society produces art, visual, musical, narrative, sculptural, because creativity seems to be inseparable from consciousness itself. The 40,000-year-old flute reminds us that sophistication of thought, emotional complexity, and aesthetic sensibility aren't products of civilization. They're prerequisites. They're foundations. They were there from the beginning, wherever beginning actually lies in the deep time of human emergence. The flute still plays. Its notes carry across 40 millennia, a melody connecting us to someone whose daily life we cannot reconstruct, whose language we'll never hear, whose name is lost forever, but whose essential humanity resonates through carved bone and precisely positioned holes. Music endures, stories survive, and somewhere in the relationship between sound and silence, between notes carefully arranged and moments of rest between them, lies something that neither stone nor time can fully erase. Long before astronomy became a science, it was survival. The movements of celestial bodies were in abstract mathematics, but practical knowledge, as essential as knowing which plants were edible or where water flowed in dry season. The sun's annual path determined planting and harvest. The moon governed tides and likely influenced game behavior. The stars provided navigation, timekeeping, and perhaps something deeper connection to cosmic patterns that made human existence feel purposeful rather than random. Early agriculturalists had particular need for celestial knowledge. Unlike hunter-gatherers who could respond flexibly to environmental conditions, farmers committed labor months in advance of any return. Planting too early meant seeds rotting in cold soil. Planting too late meant insufficient growing season. The difference between successful harvest and starvation often hinged on timing measured in days. So they watched the sky with urgent attention. They noted heliacal risings, the first appearance of specific stars just before dawn after periods of invisibility. They tracked solstices, the sun's maximum northern and southern positions, marking seasonal extremes. They observed equinoxes, when day and night balanced in equal length. These weren't abstract observations, but practical calendars written in light across darkness. The Nile civilization organized itself around celestial events tied to terrestrial cycles. Sirius, the brightest star, reappeared in the pre-dawn sky each year just as the Nile's flood began. This coincidence apparent from Egyptian latitudes provided reliable advance, warning of the inundation that deposited fertile silt across floodplains. Temples oriented to Sirius could function as calendrical observatories, marking the critical moment when farmers should prepare fields for the coming growing season. In Britain, Stonehenge's famous alignment to summer solstice sunrise demonstrates similar thinking on monumental scale. Standing at the center of the stone circle on the longest day of the year, an observer would see the sun rise directly above the heel stone, an outlier positioned precisely for this effect. The effort required to achieve this alignment, surveying, calculating, transporting, and erecting massive stones with precision sufficient to capture a celestial event, speaks to how important such markers were to the builders. But Stonehenge reveals additional sophistication. The stones also align to winter solstice sunset, to major and minor lunar standstills, extreme positions of moonrise and moonset that occur on 18-year cycles, and possibly to other celestial events still debated by archaeoastronomers. The monument functioned as a complex calendrical computer, encoding multiple cycles into durable stone that would maintain accuracy across generations. Across the ocean, ancestral Puebloan peoples in what's now the American Southwest created their own celestial observatories. At Chaco Canyon, certain buildings align with solstices and equinoxes. The Sun Dagger site features 3 stone slabs positioned such that during summer solstice, a dagger of light pierces the center of a carved spiral. During winter solstice, 2 light daggers frame the spiral's edges. The precision required suggests careful observation over years, detailed planning, and clear understanding of the sun's annual cycle. These examples represent only the most obvious archaeoastronomical sites, places where alignments are clear, enough to convince skeptical archaeologists. Countless other structures probably incorporated celestial orientations that we can no longer recognize because the buildings are ruined, the cultural context is lost, or the alignments are subtle enough to remain disputed. Beyond practical calendrics lay deeper significance. Many cultures conceived of earth and sky as interconnected realms, with terrestrial events mirroring celestial patterns. The Egyptian pharaoh was associated with Horus, a sky god. His earthly rule reflected cosmic order. Mesopotamian ziggurats served as mountains connecting earth to heaven, allowing gods to descend and humans to ascend. Chinese emperors mediated between heaven and earth, their legitimacy dependent on maintaining proper relationship with celestial forces. This wasn't a primitive superstition, but sophisticated philosophy, an understanding that human societies don't exist in isolation, but as parts of larger systems. The same forces that govern planetary motion govern seasons, climate, life cycles. To align human activity with celestial patterns was to harmonize with natural law, to cooperate with reality rather than struggle against it. Water and sky, earth and stars, these ancient architects understood them as unified systems. Rivers flowed according to celestial rhythms. Floods followed stellar calendars. The moon pulled tides and perhaps influenced rainfall. To build successfully, to farm productively, to live sustainably required knowledge of both terrestrial and celestial patterns. We've since separated astronomy from daily life, relegated it to specialists and hobbyists. But for most of human history, the sky was intimate knowledge, essential information, a constant presence in consciousness. The ancients didn't just look at stars. They lived beneath them, organized their lives around them, built monuments to honor and track them. The first architects weren't just builders of stone and earth. They were architects of time itself, translating cosmic cycles into human meaning. 20,000 years ago, the world looked profoundly different. Ice sheets kilometers thick covered much of North America, Northern Europe, and Asia. Glaciers locked up so much water that global sea levels stood roughly 120 meters lower than today. Coastlines extended far beyond their current positions. What we now consider continental shelves were coastal plains, river valleys, habitable landscapes. The English Channel didn't exist. Britain connected directly to continental Europe via a land bridge called Doggerland, a region of rolling hills, forests, marshes, and rivers. The Mediterranean was smaller, its shores pushed outward. The Persian Gulf was dry land, its basin a river valley. Southeast Asian islands connected into continuous landmasses. Entire geographies we now consider separated by water-formed single territories. Then, as Earth's orbital parameters gradually shifted, the ice began to melt. Not uniformly, not steadily, but in pulses and surges. Sometimes the melting proceeded slowly over centuries. Other times, catastrophic events released massive quantities of water with shocking speed. Ice dams holding back glacial lakes collapsed. Ice shelves calved into oceans. Meltwater rushed toward seas that rose decade by decade, meter by meter. For humans living in coastal regions and coasts are where humans preferentially settle, where resources concentrate, where rivers meet seas and terrestrial meets marine abundance. The rising waters represented ongoing catastrophe. Not sudden enough to kill everyone in dramatic floods, but relentless enough that every generation watched the sea advance, watched familiar landmarks vanish beneath waves, watched territories shrink as water reclaimed land. Geologists have identified particularly dramatic events. Meltwater Pulse 1A, around 14,600 years ago, raised global sea levels roughly 16 to 25 meters in less than 500 years, multiple meters per century. Meltwater Pulse 1B, approximately 11,500 years ago, added another event of similar magnitude. These weren't gradual changes a society could adapt to through minor adjustments. These were civilizational challenges requiring mass migrations, territorial reorganizations, and wholesale abandonment of established settlements. Consider the implications for human cultures. Coastal fishing villages, perhaps inhabited for generations, with sacred sites, burial grounds, developed territories, would have been progressively inundated. First the beaches disappeared, then the river mouths moved inland, then the village itself required relocation, then the new village needed relocation. Again and again, communities retreated before advancing seas that showed no sign of stopping. Migration wasn't simple. The territories people moved into were already occupied. Competition intensified. Resources became scarcer as populations concentrated in shrinking habitable zones. Conflicts likely erupted as displaced peoples encountered established societies unwilling to share increasingly precious land. The archaeological evidence for this period is frustratingly incomplete, precisely because so much of it now lies underwater. The coastal plains where early settlements would have concentrated are now beneath meters of ocean, covered by millennia of marine sediments, inaccessible to most archaeological methods. What we know of early coastal cultures comes from the rare highlands that were coastal during the Ice Age, but remain above water today, or from extraordinary preservation conditions. Doggerland provides a haunting example. This region between Britain and continental Europe supported human populations for thousands of years. Archaeological evidence, mostly retrieved by accident in fishing nets, includes tools, animal bones, and occasionally human remains. Doggerland likely hosted substantial populations, taking advantage of rich coastal and riverine resources. Then, around 6200 BCE, a massive underwater landslide off Norway's coast triggered a tsunami, the Storegga slide, that devastated whatever coastal communities remained as Doggerland finally succumbed to rising seas. Similar stories played out globally. The Persian Gulf basin flooded relatively rapidly in geological terms, transforming a river valley into a shallow sea. Southeast Asian populations watched as rising waters separated their territories into archipelagos. Australian Aboriginals, whose oral traditions remarkably preserve memories of coastlines now drowned, witnessed their continent shrink as seas reclaimed lowlands. The psychological impact must have been profound. Imagine watching, over your lifetime, the sea advance hundreds of meters inland. Imagine your grandparents describing lands you can no longer reach, now visible only as shallow waters. Imagine the stories that would emerge from such experienced stories of a world drowning, of lands swallowed by angry waters, of divine punishment or cosmic catastrophe reshaping reality itself. These stories survived. They transformed through countless retellings, merged with other narratives, accumulated metaphorical and religious significance. But at their cores, many flood myths may preserve genuine cultural memories of real events, not universal global floods, but regional catastrophes traumatic enough to become foundational narratives for societies that endured them. The waters eventually stabilized. By roughly 6,000 years ago, sea levels approached their current positions. Coastlines settled into familiar configurations. The Great Drowning ended. Humanity could finally build on coasts without expecting seas to reclaim their work within generations. But the memory lingered. And beneath the waves, entombed in silt and sand, the drowned world waits a vast archaeological record of coastal cultures whose achievements we may never properly document. Beneath the Mediterranean's blue expanse lie cities, harbors, temples, entire landscapes preserved by water and silt. Some were abandoned when sea levels rose. Others sank during earthquakes, tectonic subsidence slowly tilting coastal regions beneath the waves. Still others succumbed to coastal erosion, storm surges, tsunamis, the countless mechanisms by which the sea reclaims what was built on its shores. Alexandria's ancient harbor district offers one of the better studied examples. Once a jewel of Hellenistic civilization, home to the famous Pharos Lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, much of Alexandria's waterfront now rests underwater. Earthquakes in the 4th and 14th centuries toppled buildings, collapsed harbor works, and subsided portions of the city beneath sea level. Marine archaeologists exploring the harbor floor have discovered colossal statues, column drums, building blocks, and remnants of the lighthouse itself. Massive granite blocks still showing signs of ancient engineering. But Alexandria, while spectacular, represents a relatively recent loss. Written histories describe the city's construction and glory. We know what was lost. More intriguing are the structures discovered at depths, suggesting much greater age sites that don't correspond to any known historical civilization. Off the coast of India, near the Gulf of Combat, side-scan sonar revealed geometric patterns resembling urban planning's straight features, regular spacing, apparent foundations at depths of 30 to 40 meters. The structures, if that's what they are, would have been above water only during much lower sea levels, potentially dating them to before 8,000 BCE. Controversy surrounds the interpretation. Are they geological formations, artifacts of sonar processing, or genuine archaeological remains of prehistoric coastal settlements? Investigations continue, but the depths involved make definitive answers difficult. Similar anomalies appear scattered across submerged continental shelves. Off Japan's Yonaguni Island, a massive stone formation features flat surfaces, sharp edges, apparent steps, and carved details that some researchers interpret as artificial a submerged temple or ceremonial center. Geologists counter that the rock's natural sedimentary layers could fracture into geometric patterns through entirely natural processes. The debate remains unresolved, complicated by the difficulty of underwater investigation and the interpretative ambiguity of features that could be either natural or modified by human hands. The Black Sea presents perhaps the most intriguing scenario. Geological evidence suggests that around 5,600 BCE, rising Mediterranean waters breached a natural dam, flooding what had been a lower freshwater lake and creating the saltwater Black Sea. Flood would have been catastrophic sea levels in the basin rising rapidly, inundating coastal settlements, forcing mass migrations. Some researchers propose this event as a possible inspiration for flood myths across multiple cultures, including the biblical account, though direct connections remain speculative. Underwater surveys in the Black Sea have discovered remarkably preserved shipwrecks, wooden vessels thousands of years old, kept from decay by the sea's anoxic deep waters. But less publicized are occasional reports of structure stone arrangements, apparent building foundations at depths suggesting occupation before the flood. If confirmed and properly dated, these could represent direct evidence of the cultures displaced by the sea's rise. The challenge with underwater archaeology is manifold. Visibility is often poor. Currents complicate careful excavation. Depths make extended investigation difficult. Sediment covers most features, requiring extensive survey work just to identify potential sites. Funding is limited. Underwater work is expensive, time-consuming, and often produces ambiguous results that don't justify continued investment. Most critically, our methods privilege the easily accessible. Shallow waters near modern coasts get surveyed. Deeper waters, far from land, remain largely unexplored, despite being precisely where Ice Age coastal settlements would now lie. The archaeology of drowned coastlines remains in its infancy, with vast territories barely examined. Yet what has been found tantalizes. Harbors that served ships in eras before writing. Breakwaters constructed with techniques we can identify, but not fully explain. Quarries where stone was cut and loaded onto vessels for transport to destinations now uncertain. Each discovery reminds us how much has been lost, not just to the ravages of time on dry land, but to the sea's patient swallowing of human achievement. Some sites may never be recovered. Silt buries them too deeply. Depth makes them inaccessible. Decay, even in water, claims wooden structures and organic materials. But others wait in a state of strange preservation called dark, quiet, holding secrets about cultures that lived when the world's geography looked different, when seas stood lower, when landscapes now drowned hosted civilizations whose stories we've yet to hear. The lost harbors sleep beneath waves. Occasionally, by chance or dedicated effort, one awakens to light again. A harbor wall, a fallen column, a carved inscription speaking across millennia from a world we thought lost completely. Each recovery suggests how much more remains hidden, waiting for the right technology, the right questions, the right shifting of sand and tide to reveal what the sea has kept secret all these centuries. Every rock is a book, written in languages of pressure, heat, and time. Sedimentary stones preserve moments' grains settling in ancient seas, shells accumulating on vanished shores, volcanic ash drifting down to seal particular instants in geological amber. Metamorphic rocks record transformations, the intense forces that reshape crust, the collisions that raise mountains, the deep burial that converts limestone to marble. Igneous rocks capture creation itself, molten earth, crystallizing into permanence, frozen moments of the planet's internal heat seeking surface. Limestone, in particular, serves as history's archive. Formed from accumulated marine organism shells, corals, microscopic plankton, each layer represents a period when seas covered the region, when life flourished in waters now vanished. A limestone cliff face becomes a timeline, individual strata marking different eras, different ocean conditions, different communities of creatures that once thrived before being compressed into stone. Look closely at limestone's surface, and you'll see them fossils. Not the dramatic dinosaur skeletons that populate museums, but humbler traces, shell impressions, coral patterns. Occasionally, the mineralized spiral of an ammonite, an extinct cephalopod whose beautiful geometry still evokes wonder millions of years after its kind disappeared from Earth's oceans. These aren't extraordinary preservation events. They're ordinary limestone, the standard building block for countless ancient structures, each piece potentially containing fossils waiting to be noticed. The Egyptians built with limestone, quarried from regions that were seabeds when dinosaurs roamed. The blocks forming the pyramids occasionally reveal shells, sea creatures compressed into stone, now incorporated into humanity's most recognizable monuments. Did the ancient masons notice? Almost certainly. Did they wonder at the meaning marine fossils hundreds of kilometers from any sea, high in desert escarpments? We can only speculate. Greek philosophers certainly noticed. Xenophanes, writing in the 6th century BCE, documented fossils of marine organisms found far inland and at high elevations. He reasoned correctly that these regions must have once been underwater, that the land itself transforms over spans of time incomprehensibly long compared to human generations. His observations laid groundwork for geological thinking, though his insights would be forgotten and rediscovered multiple times across subsequent centuries. Other ancient peoples developed similar awareness. Chinese scholars documented fossils they called dragon bones, incorporating them into mythology, while also recognizing them as remnants of creatures no longer living. Native American traditions sometimes referenced fossils, interpreting them through frameworks of story and spiritual meaning rather than through materialistic geology, but clearly demonstrating observational awareness. The stone itself forgets nothing. Weathering patterns reveal exposure to different climates. Chemical composition indicates formation conditions, temperature, pressure, mineral availability. Grain size and sorting patterns distinguish between different deposition environments. Fast-flowing rivers deposit coarse sediments, while still waters allow only fine particles to settle. Each characteristic encodes information that trained observers can extract. Stromatolites, layered structures built by ancient bacteria, represent some of Earth's oldest evidence of life, dating back billions of years. These formations, still being created in rare locations today, demonstrate that stone can preserve even microbial existence across nearly incomprehensible timescales. The bacteria are long dead, but the limestone structures they built endure, silent testimony to life's ancient persistence. Sandstone preserves different memories. Desert sandstones often show cross-bedding layers tilted at angles, indicating ancient dune formations. Reading these patterns, geologists reconstruct wind directions, climate conditions, the shape and scale of sand seas that existed hundreds of millions of years ago. The Navajo sandstone of the American Southwest, famous for its spectacular red cliffs, formed as a vast desert during the Jurassic period. Dinosaurs walked across those dunes, occasionally leaving footprints that fossilized when rare floods dampened the sand. Volcanic rocks record catastrophes. Ash layers compressed into distinctive strata, called bentonite, mark explosive eruptions, often distributed across vast regions by atmospheric winds. These ash layers serve as time markers in geological columns, single events creating distinctive signatures that can be correlated across hundreds of kilometers, allowing precise dating of surrounding sediments. Even erosion patterns preserve information. Differential weathering, where harder layers resist while softer layers recede, creates stepped cliff faces and distinctive profiles that reveal the underlying structure. Wind, water, freeze-thaw cycles all sculpt stone according to its composition, creating forms that encode both the rock's properties and the environmental forces acting upon it. The memory of stone operates on scales that mock human temporality. A fossil formed 200 million years ago, preserved through continental drift, mountain building, erosion, and weathering, finally revealed when the right combination of geological processes exposes it to air and light. This represents patience beyond comprehension. Memory maintained not through active effort, but through the simple persistence of matter. Ancient peoples who built with stone were, consciously or not, building with time itself. The limestone blocks they quarried carried fossils hundreds of millions of years old. The granite they shaped crystallized deep in Earth's crust during mountain building events predating all animal life. The marble they carved represented ancient limestone transformed through immense heat and pressure during continental collisions. Every stone structure is, in this sense, a time machine, not transporting consciousness through years, but rather assembling fragments of deep time into human-scale monuments. The pyramids contain seabeds from the Cretaceous. The Parthenon incorporates marble formed through Paleozoic metamorphism. Gothic cathedrals rise from limestone deposited during the Jurassic, assembled by medieval masons into forms that will themselves become geological features given enough time. The stone remembers. It remembers oceans that covered continents, mountains that rose and eroded away, climates that oscillated between greenhouse heat and glacial cold. It remembers volcanoes and asteroid impacts, mass extinctions and evolutionary radiations. It remembers, with perfect fidelity, everything that happened to it since its formation. We simply need to learn how to read what's written there. Imagine you are a stonemason in ancient Egypt, quarrying limestone for a new temple. Your copper chisel bites into the pale stone, and as a block splits away, you notice something unexpected: a perfect spiral, the coiled shell of a creature unlike anything in the Nile. It's stone clearly, the same material as the surrounding rock, yet it holds the unmistakable form of life. How do you interpret this? Ancient peoples certainly noticed fossils. The evidence appears in their writings, their myths, and occasionally their deliberate placement of fossiliferous stones in significant contexts. But their interpretations, filtered through different epistemological frameworks, rarely aligned with modern geological understanding. Some fossils were straightforward enough. Shells embedded in stone at high elevations or far inland suggested, even to ancient minds, that seas once covered the land. Greek and Roman philosophers documented this observation. But more mysterious fossils, giant bones belonging to extinct megafauna, strange spiral forms, impressions of creatures with no living analogues, these invited more creative explanation. Dragons, giants, mythological creatures, these categories absorbed fossils that didn't fit familiar frameworks. Enormous bones emerging from eroding hillsides could reasonably suggest titanic beings from legendary past ages. Without concepts of extinction and deep time, interpreting such remains as belonging to supernatural or legendary creatures made perfect sense. The fossils were real. The interpretation mapped them onto available explanatory frameworks. Some cultures incorporated fossils into religious contexts. Certain Native American traditions associated fossils with ancestral spirits or supernatural events. Hindu texts reference stones containing forms of sacred creatures. Chinese traditions, as mentioned, called them dragon bones and attributed medicinal properties, grinding them into powders for healing, a practice that, ironically, has destroyed countless scientifically valuable specimens. European medieval Christianity interpreted fossils through biblical frameworks. Ammonites, the coiled shells of extinct cephalopods, were sometimes called serpent stones and associated with legends of saints who turned serpents into stone. The beautiful geometry of these fossils, their ubiquity in certain limestone formations, made them objects of fascination long before their biological nature was understood. Fossil woodstone that preserves the cellular structure of ancient trees presented its own mysteries. How could wood turn to stone? The petrification process involves mineral replacement of organic material, preserving original structures while transforming composition. To ancient observers without chemistry or microscopy, this transformation likely seemed magical, a transmutation of substance as profound as alchemical dreams of turning lead to gold. Some fossils were spectacular enough to spawn location-specific legends. The Giant S Causeway in Ireland, a formation of basalt columns created by volcanic cooling, was attributed to legendary figures. Other geological features containing notable fossils became associated with mythic events, the stones themselves serving as proof of stories otherwise dismissed as mere tales. Consider how this might have functioned psychologically. Ancient peoples lived in landscapes saturated with evidence of deep time and radical transformation, yet lacked frameworks for interpreting that evidence scientifically. The world itself seemed enchanted. Stones contained creatures. Mountains held bones of giants. The earth bore witness to impossibly ancient events. This wasn't ignorance, but rather a different mode of making meaning from observation. The temples built with fossiliferous limestone thus contained, embedded in their very fabric, mysteries. A priest tracing patterns in a limestone wall might encounter a shell, a coral, an ancient organism compressed into the sacred architecture. Did this enhance the temple's significance? Did it suggest connection to primordial forces, divine power, the deep substrate of reality itself? We'll never know most of these interpretations. Oral traditions rarely survived. Written records from ancient cultures often don't bother explaining what was considered obvious. We're left inferring from fragments, from brief mentions, from the occasional detailed account that bothered to document what contemporaries thought unremarkable. What we can say is that fossils have always provoked wonder. The sight of life's form preserved in stone, especially when that form is strange, beautiful, or impossible according to contemporary understanding, triggers something fundamental in human consciousness. It suggests mortality transcended, pattern persisting beyond individual existence, a possibility that what seems permanent can transform completely. Modern paleontology has demystified fossils, explained them through processes of chemistry, biology, and geology. We know how organisms become stone, how sediments compress over millions of years, how particular conditions favor preservation. We've built entire evolutionary histories from fossil sequences, traced lineages across hundreds of millions of years. Yet something of the original wonder remains. To hold a fossil is to hold time. That shell you find on a hillside might be older than all human civilization, older than our species' emergence, older than the formation of the Great Rift Valley, where our ancestors first stood upright. It existed through ice ages and tropical epochs, through continental configurations unrecognizable today, through extinctions and radiations and the slow, patient reshaping of everything. The temples of ancient civilizations, built with stone quarried from fossil-bearing formations, are temples of time in more than metaphorical sense. They're assemblages of deep history, constructed by cultures barely aware of the temporal depths embedded in their materials, yet perhaps intuiting something profound about stone's capacity to remember, to preserve, to testify across spans that dwarf all human ambition. The fossils remain, in museum drawers and quarry faces and temple walls, each one a small miracle of preservation, a fragment of life's vast story, written in stone's patient language. In Egypt's western desert, roughly 150 kilometers southwest of Cairo, lies a place called Wadi al-Haytan, the Valley of the Whales. The name is literal. The sandy valley floor is scattered with fossils of ancient whales, not just fragments, but complete skeletons, some over 15 meters long, lying exposed beneath the relentless desert sun. These aren't modern whales that somehow found themselves absurdly stranded far from water. These are basalosaurids, primitive whales from the Eocene epoch, roughly 40 million years old. But here's what makes them extraordinary. They have legs. Small, vestigial, utterly useless for supporting the creature's massive weight, but unmistakably legs nonetheless, hind limbs, complete with femurs, tibias, and even tiny feet. 40 million years ago, this desert was an ocean, the Tethys Sea, a vast waterway that separated continents before Africa and Eurasia collided to create the Mediterranean. The region where whales now fossilize in desert sand was then warm, shallow marine environment teeming with life. Sharks, sea snakes, primitive manatees, and these transitional whales populated waters that lapped against shores now buried under hundreds of meters of sediment. The basalosaurids represent evolution, caught mid-transition. Their ancestors, just 10 million years earlier, had been land mammals, furry, four-legged creatures inhabiting coastal environments. Gradually, across innumerable generations, selection pressures favored aquatic adaptations. Limbs modified for swimming. Bodies became streamlined. Nostrils migrated upward toward what would eventually become blowholes. The transformation from land mammal to fully aquatic whale was underway, but not yet complete. The hind legs preserved in Wadi al-Haytan's fossils represent vestiges of terrestrial ancestry. Too small to aid movement on land, they likely served no function whatsoever, evolutionary baggage not yet entirely eliminated. Later whales would reduce these further. until modern species retain only fragmentary hip bones buried deep within their bodies, anatomical memories of legs their ancestors once walked upon. The site is a UNESCO World Heritage location now, protected and managed. Visitors can walk among the fossils, many left in situ rather than removed to museums. The experience is profoundly disorienting, standing in one of Earth's most arid regions, surrounded by desert to every horizon, while beneath your feet lie dozens of whale skeletons testifying to an ocean that vanished millions of years before humans existed. It's a reminder, visceral and undeniable, of how radically Earth transforms. Not just climates and coastlines, but fundamental geography. Oceans appear and disappear. Deserts bloom, then desiccate. Mountains rise and erode away. What seems permanent solid land, empty desert, familiar configurations is merely a snapshot, a single frame in a movie that's been playing for billions of years. The whales themselves invite contemplation of evolution's patient creativity. The transition from land to sea required wholesale reorganization, respiratory systems, circulatory adaptations, locomotive mechanisms, sensory modifications. Each change must have provided some advantage, some marginal improvement in survival or reproduction that selection amplified across generations. And it worked. Modern whales are supremely adapted to oceanic life. They're the largest animals ever to exist on Earth, outmassing even the largest dinosaurs. They navigate entire ocean basins, dive to crushing depths, communicate across thousands of kilometers, possess intelligence we're only beginning to appreciate. The awkward transitional forms fossilized at Wadi al-Haydn, creatures that were neither fully terrestrial nor fully aquatic, gave rise to some of evolution's most spectacular successes. Yet they made this journey in an ocean that no longer exists, in a configuration of continents unrecognizable today, leaving their remains in what became, through tectonic accident, one of the planet's driest places. The irony is almost poetic. Whales in the desert, oceans locked in stone, the patient testimony of fossils, speaking truths that would have seemed absurd to anyone who encountered them before geology decoded Earth history. Children visiting Wadi al-Haydn can reach out and touch backbones 40 million years old, run their hands along ribs that once protected hearts, pumping blood through bodies navigating ancient seas. The educational impact is immediate and profound. Evolution isn't abstract theory, but tangible reality, bones you can see, touch, marvel at. The desert keeps these secrets casually, revealing them through erosion, burying others with each sandstorm. Who knows what else lies beneath the surface, waiting for wind and time to expose it to sunlight again. More whales, certainly. Other marine creatures. Perhaps transitional forms we haven't yet discovered, filling gaps in evolutionary understanding, answering questions we haven't learned to ask. For now, the whales sleep in their desert tomb-legged reminders that nothing is as permanent as it seems, that oceans and deserts trade places, that life flows into whatever shapes selection requires, that transformation is the only constant in the patient, grinding passage of deep time. The ancient Egyptians divided the night sky into constellations and asterisms that bore little resemblance to the Greek forms we've inherited. Sahu, roughly corresponding to Orion, represented Osiris, god of death and rebirth. Sopdet, our Sirius, was associated with Isis. The northern stars that never set below the horizon were called the imperishable ones, souls of the blessed dead who achieved eternal life through proper ritual. These weren't just stories. The Egyptian calendar was explicitly tied to Sirius's heliacal rising, its first appearance in the pre-dawn sky after a period of invisibility. This event occurred from Egyptian latitudes, just as the Nile began its annual flood. The coincidence was too useful to be accidental, so the Egyptians built their civil calendar around it, beginning the year when Sirius reappeared. Temples oriented to capture this moment, marking it architecturally. But the Egyptians went further. The pyramids of Giza, according to some researchers, may have been positioned to mirror Orion's Belt 3 stars in a diagonal line, with the smallest slightly offset, matching the layout of the three pyramids. The correlation isn't perfect, and debate continues about whether it's intentional or coincidental. But the broader point remains undisputed. The Egyptians encoded celestial knowledge in terrestrial architecture systematically and precisely. Farther north, in the British Isles, Stonehenge and associated monuments demonstrate comparable sophistication. The heel stone marks summer solstice sunrise, but the monument's complexity extends far beyond this single alignment. The Sarsen circle and trilithons frame multiple celestial events. The blue stones transported from Wales, over 200 kilometers away, may have had astronomical significance related to their original location. More provocatively, some archaeoastronomers propose that the entire Stonehenge landscape, including nearby henges, barrows, and the cursus, forms a unified ceremonial complex oriented to multiple celestial events. If so, it represents landscape-scale astronomy, where not just individual monuments, but entire territories, are organized according to cosmic principles. In Mesoamerica, the Maya developed arguably the most sophisticated astronomical traditions of any pre-modern civilization. They tracked Venus with remarkable precision, noting its synodic period, the time between successive appearances at the same position relative to the Sun, and incorporating it into calendrical and ritual cycles. The Caracol at Chichen Itza, a distinctive round tower, contains window alignments marking Venus's extreme northern and southern rising positions. The Maya also tracked Mars, Mercury, even Jupiter, though Venus held special significance, possibly because its brightness and dramatic appearances and disappearances made it the most visually striking planet. The Dresden Codex, one of few surviving Maya books, contains detailed Venus tables predicting its positions across decades, adjusted for the slight drift between Venus's cycle and the Maya calendar. Perhaps most impressively, the Maya understood that their calendar would eventually drift out of sync with solar years, so they incorporated correction mechanisms analogous to our leap years, but more complex. This demonstrates not just observational astronomy, but mathematical sophistication, the ability to model celestial mechanics accurately enough to predict and compensate for cumulative errors. In the American Southwest, the aforementioned Chaco Canyon sun dagger is just one example of ancestral Puebloan archaeoastronomy. Casa Rinconada, a great kiva, has windows that allow light to enter in patterns marking solstices. Pueblo Bonito's architecture incorporates numerous alignments to solar, lunar, and possibly stellar events. The careful positioning of buildings, the strategic placement of windows, the overall site planning all suggest that Chaco functioned partly as an astronomical observatory and calendrical center. These examples merely scratch the surface. Worldwide, across every continent where agriculture developed, cultures built monuments aligned to celestial events. The consistency is striking. Independent societies separated by oceans and millennia arrived at similar conclusions. The sky matters. Celestial cycles govern terrestrial processes. Encoding this knowledge in durable form ensures its preservation across generations. But why build monuments? Why not simply pass knowledge orally or mark calendrical information on portable media? The answer likely involves permanence and public function. An oral tradition can be disrupted, elders die unexpectedly, lineages break, information gets distorted. A monument endures. It functions regardless of whether specific individuals remember its meaning. The stones themselves preserve the knowledge, readable by anyone who learns the interpretative framework. Moreover, monuments served communal purposes. They were gathering places, ceremonial centers, locations where collective observations could be made and verified. When the sun rose precisely through a particular doorway on summer solstice, everyone present could witness it, a public demonstration of calendrical accuracy that reinforced cultural authority and astronomical expertise. The monuments also established territorial claims and cultural identity. A society capable of building Stonehenge or the Great Pyramid was making statements about power, organization, sophistication. The monuments declared, "We understand cosmic principles. We can mobilize labor for multi-generational projects. We have mastered time itself." From our perspective, separated from these cultures by millennia, the monuments remain legible. We can stand where ancient astronomers stood, watch the same alignments, see what they saw. The stars have shifted slightly. Axial precession gradually moves constellations relative to seasons, but computers can reconstruct ancient skies, confirming alignments that no longer function but once marked crucial dates. The first architects of water and sky weren't just building structures. They were building relationships between Earth and cosmos, between human time and celestial time, between the ephemeral and the eternal. Their monuments still speak if we learn their language. The sun still rises through ancient doorways on summer solstice. The stones still mark the extremes of lunar motion. The stars, patient beyond human comprehension, continue their slow wheel across night skies, just as they did when the first stones were raised. Before anyone recorded astronomical knowledge on papyrus or clay, before any scribe tallied planetary positions, before writing itself existed, humans were watching the sky. And if they watched, which they certainly did for practical reasons of navigation and calendrics, if nothing else, they likely developed sophisticated mental models, oral traditions, mnemonic systems for preserving observations across generations. This creates an intriguing historical problem. Writing, where it emerges, often appears already encoding complex astronomical and calendrical information. The earliest Sumerian tablets include celestial observations. Egyptian inscriptions reference astronomical events. The Maya codices, among the earliest writings we have from Mesoamerica, contain astronomical tables of impressive precision. If writing appears already encoding complex astronomy, the knowledge itself must predate the writing, perhaps by centuries or millennia. So how was this information preserved, transmitted, refined during the pre-literate period? The most obvious answer: oral tradition. Stories, songs, poems, and chants can encode factual information remarkably efficiently. Rhyme, meter, and narrative structure aid memory. Sacred stories can preserve technical knowledge under layers of metaphor. An Australian Aboriginal song might describe a route across landscape listing landmarks, water sources, safe camping spots, while simultaneously telling a Dreamtime story about ancestral beings. The factual information rides within the mythological framework, preserved because the myths are valued and repeated. Celestial knowledge could function similarly. A creation myth might encode the relationships between constellations, the timing of their appearances, their connections to seasonal events. A story about gods and heroes might preserve star names, positions, and mythical associations that help observers remember and predict celestial events. The epic poetry would be valued for religious or entertainment reasons, but would simultaneously function as astronomical database. Some researchers propose that certain myths preserve information about celestial events, so ancient that written records couldn't possibly account for their accuracy. Precession, the slow wobble of Earth's x-axis, completing one cycle every 26,000 years, shifts the position of stars relative to seasons. The age of Aquarius and similar concepts reflect this. The constellation visible behind the sun at spring equinox slowly changes, spending roughly 2,000 years in each zodiacal constellation. If certain myths reference stellar configurations that only made sense during specific precessional ages, they might preserve observations thousands of years old. This is controversial. Skeptics note that myths transform so drastically through retelling that attempting to extract precise astronomical data from them is likely futile. But proponents point to specific examples where oral traditions seem to preserve information verifiable through astronomical computation. The Pleiades, a distinctive star cluster visible worldwide, appear in myths across numerous cultures. Many traditions associate them with seven sisters, despite only 6 stars being easily visible to most observers. Some researchers propose this reflects memory from periods when the cluster appeared different, or when a particular star was brighter than it currently is. Others suggest it simply reflects mythological preference for 7 as a sacred number, with reality being forced to fit narrative convention. More concrete evidence comes from monument alignments that reference stars no longer in the same positions. If a temple was built to align with the star's rising position, and that star has since shifted due to precession, we can calculate when the alignment would have been accurate. Some monuments show alignments that only made sense thousands of years before their conventional construction dates, suggesting either that the alignments are coincidental, that the construction dates are wrong, or that the builders were incorporating ancient knowledge about former star positions into their architecture. Consider Göbekli Tepe again. Some researchers analyzing the site's iconography propose it preserves memories of comet impacts or celestial events dating to the Younger Dryas period, dramatic climate oscillation around 12,000 years ago. The evidence is circumstantial, pattern matching between carved symbols and astronomical events. But if the interpretation has any validity, it suggests that oral traditions preserved technical astronomical knowledge for thousands of years before it was finally encoded in megalithic form. Indigenous Australian traditions offer the clearest examples of oral transmission across extraordinary time spans. Some Dreamtime stories describe landscapes now underwater, coastlines drowned 7,000 years ago. The stories preserved the memory through countless generations, accurate enough that modern researchers can identify specific locations referenced in the myths. If such traditions can preserve geographical information for 7 millennia, might they also preserve astronomical observations across similar spans? The night sky before writing was the same sky we see today minus light pollution. The stars wheeled in their patterns, planets wandered, the moon waxed and waned, eclipses occurred, meteors streaked, auroras glowed. All the celestial events we now explain through astrophysics were visible then, prompting the same questions. What are these lights? Why do they move as they do? What do they mean? Without telescopes or physics, early astronomers still noticed patterns, regularities, cycles. Venus's 8-year pattern, 5 synodic periods nearly equaling 8 solar years, was known to multiple cultures. The Metonic cycle, 19 solar years, equaling almost exactly 235 lunar months, was discovered independently by several societies, used to synchronize lunar and solar calendars. These discoveries required decades of patient observation, careful record-keeping, even without writing, mathematical reasoning, and institutional continuity. They suggest that pre-literate societies developed impressive astronomical competence through oral tradition, apprenticeship, and cultural mechanisms we can only partially reconstruct. The sky before writing was humanity's first text to read nightly, interpreted constantly, encoded into myths and monuments, passed from generation to generation through stories that entertained while they educated. When writing finally emerged, it transcribed knowledge already ancient, preserved systems already sophisticated, documented observations already refined through millennia of attention. We've forgotten most of this. The oral traditions died when societies collapsed or transitioned to literacy. The mnemonic systems were abandoned once writing proved more reliable. The myths transformed into entertainment, their technical content lost or obscured. But the sky remains, still wheeling through patterns our ancestors knew intimately, still speaking to those who learned to listen. The story is told in Mesopotamia, inscribed on clay tablets that survived in the ruins of ancient libraries. Utnapishtim, warned by the god Aa of an impending deluge, builds a great boat. He loads it with his family, craftsmen, animals, representatives of all living things. The rains come, torrential and unrelenting. Waters rise until even the mountains are covered. The boat drifts across a world transformed into endless ocean. Finally, after days that blend into weeks, the waters recede. Utnapishtim releases birds to search for land. A dove returns. A swallow returns. Finally, a raven does not return, has found dry ground. The boat comes to rest on a mountain. Utnapishtim makes sacrifice. The gods, chastened by the destruction they've caused, promise never again to unleash such catastrophe. The story is familiar because it was borrowed, adapted, and incorporated into Hebrew scripture as the account of Noah. But the Mesopotamian version predates the biblical account by over 1,000 years, appearing in the Epic of Gilgamesh and earlier Sumerian flood narratives. The similarities are too precise to be coincidental. This is clear cultural transmission, one tradition inheriting and modifying another's foundational myth. But Mesopotamia and the Levant aren't alone in preserving flood narratives. Across the world, separated by oceans and millennia, cultures developed strikingly similar stories. A Greek legend tells of Deucalion, warned by his father Prometheus, who survives a flood sent by Zeus by building an ark. Hindu texts describe Manu, saved from a great deluge by a fish, who guides his boat to a mountaintop. Chinese mythology preserves accounts of catastrophic floods requiring heroic efforts to control. Native American traditions, from the Pacific Northwest to the Amazon basin, include flood stories where humanity narrowly survives aquatic apocalypse. The global distribution of flood myths has prompted two competing interpretations. One camp argues for independent development floods are universal natural disasters, so flood stories emerge independently in every culture that experiences major flooding. The other camp suggests the myths preserve cultural memories of real global or near-global catastrophic events, perhaps related to post-glacial sea level rise. The scientific consensus leans toward the former interpretation, but with nuance. There was no single global flood covering all land surfaces simultaneously. The geological evidence definitively rules this out. But there were dramatic regional flooding events during the post-glacial period that could have traumatized populations sufficiently to generate foundational mythological narratives. The Black Sea flood hypothesis, mentioned earlier, represents one such scenario. Around 5,600 BCE, according to geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman, rising Mediterranean waters breached the natural dam at the Bosporus Strait. Seawater poured into what had been a lower freshwater lake, raising the Black Sea level by dozens of meters and flooding thousands of square kilometers of coastal lowlands. The process likely took months or years rather than days, but for people living on the shores, the result was catastrophic relentless waters advancing inland, consuming settlements, forcing mass migrations. Could this event, traumatic enough to become culturally foundational, be the kernel of truth within Mesopotamian flood myths? The timeline is plausible. Early agricultural societies were establishing themselves in the region when the flood occurred. Refugees fleeing the inundation would have carried their stories, perhaps already mythologized, perhaps not yet, but destined to become so through retelling. Over thousands of years, the story could have evolved, accumulated religious significance, merged with other narratives, eventually crystallizing into the versions recorded in cuneiform. Other regional catastrophes likely generated similar myths elsewhere. The Mediterranean experienced its own dramatic flooding when the Strait of Gibraltar formed, connecting the Atlantic to what had been an isolated, partially desiccated basin. The Zanclean flood, around 5.3 million years ago, occurred long before humans existed, so it couldn't directly inspire myths. But smaller-scale events, tsunami, from volcanic eruptions or underwater landslides, catastrophic river floods, storm surges occurred throughout human history, each potentially traumatic enough to generate lasting cultural narratives. Meltwater Pulse 1A and 1B, the dramatic sea level rise events around 14,600 and 11,500 years ago, affected coastlines globally. Populations living on Ice Age coastal plains watched, across generations, as the sea advanced relentlessly inland. This wasn't sudden enough to require ark building, but it was dramatic enough to displace entire societies, forcing migrations, destroying territories, separating populations. Such experiences could reasonably generate myths of world-drowning floods, even if the actual process took centuries. Some researchers propose that oral traditions might preserve memories of these meltwater events, passed down through hundreds of generations before being finally recorded in writing. The timescales seem implausible. Can oral traditions really preserve specific historical information for 10,000 years? Yet Australian Aboriginal examples suggest surprising longevity for geographically verifiable information in oral form. The mythological elements, divine warnings, ark construction, animal preservation, rainbow covenants clearly represent theological interpretation rather than literal history. But beneath the religious framework might lie genuine memory of trauma, real events that shaped societies so profoundly that the stories could never be forgotten, even as they transformed through countless retellings. Flood myths often share common elements beyond the basic narrative. The flood typically serves as divine punishment for human corruption or moral failing. A selected righteous individual or family receives warning and survives through special knowledge or intervention. The survivors repopulate the world, often founding the culture, telling the story and origin myth, explaining how the present society came to exist. Animals are frequently preserved, emphasizing continuity of natural order despite catastrophic disruption. These common elements likely reflect universal human psychological needs rather than shared historical events. Every culture needs origin stories. Every society develops explanations for suffering and disaster. The flood narrative provides a framework addressing multiple existential concerns simultaneously. It explains catastrophe, justifies survival, establishes moral order, and creates cultural identity. Yet the persistence of these narratives, their emotional resonance, their detailed preservation across millennia, suggests they touch something deeper than pure invention. Perhaps they channel ancestral memories, not of one global flood, but of countless regional disasters, compressed through mythological time into single archetypal events. Perhaps they preserve psychological truths about human vulnerability, about how quickly familiar worlds can transform into hostile chaos, about the thin margins separating survival from extinction. The waters have long since receded. Sea levels stabilized thousands of years ago. The coastal plains that drowned remain drowned, their archaeology largely inaccessible, their stories mostly silenced. But the myths persist, told and retold, written and rewritten, adapted into new contexts while retaining their ancient cores. They remind us that the world we inhabit is not permanent, that landscapes transform, that everything familiar can vanish beneath rising waters, literal or metaphorical. The flood legends endure because they speak truth, even when they aren't literally true. They testify that our ancestors witnessed transformations profound enough to shape every subsequent generation as understanding of reality. They preserve, in mythological amber, the memory of a drowned world. When the seas finally stopped rising, when coastlines stabilized into configurations we would recognize, when the great melting ended and ice sheets retreated to their current polar refuges, humanity faced a transformed world. The landscape of opportunity had fundamentally shifted. Productive lowlands that supported societies for generations now lay beneath ocean waters. But simultaneously, new territories emerged as glaciers retreated fertile valleys in northern latitudes, newly accessible mountain regions, river systems restructured by changed hydrology. The period following sea level stabilization, roughly beginning 6,000 years ago, marks a transition point in human history. This is when sedentary agricultural civilizations began their dramatic flourishing. Not coincidentally, stable coastlines meant communities could invest in permanent coastal settlements without expecting the sea to reclaim their work within generations. Predictable river patterns, no longer disrupted by glacial meltwater pulses, allowed sophisticated irrigation systems. Climate patterns, though still variable, settled into more reliable configurations. The great river civilizations emerged during this period. Egypt, unified around 3100 BCE, represents societies perfecting strategies developed over preceding millennia: agriculture, synchronized to flooding, storage technologies for surplus, administrative systems for coordination. But Egypt wasn't alone. Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, China's Yellow River all saw comparable developments within a relatively narrow window of time. Geologically speaking, some scholars proposed that sea level stabilization wasn't a merely coincidental timing, but rather a prerequisite for civilizational complexity. Earlier attempts at settled agriculture, they argue, would have been repeatedly disrupted by environmental instability, coastlines shifting, rivers changing course, climate patterns unpredictable. Only after the world settled into stable configuration could societies build the multi-generational infrastructure that civilization requires. Coastal regions became particularly valuable once shores stopped moving. Harbors could be developed with confidence they'd remain functional. Trade networks could rely on established ports. Fishing communities could build permanent facilities. The interface between terrestrial and marine resources, always attractive to human settlement, became reliably exploitable for the first time in thousands of years. Maritime technology advanced correspondingly. Earlier boats certainly existed. Watercraft capable of open ocean voyages date back tens of thousands of years, evidenced by human colonization of Australia and Pacific Islands. But sophisticated harbor facilities, large cargo vessels, dedicated fishing fleets, these developments accelerated once coastal geography stabilized. The Mediterranean became a highway rather than a barrier. Phoenician sailors established trade networks connecting disparate cultures. Greek colonization spread settlements across the sea's entire periphery. Egyptian ships navigated to Lebanon for cedar, to Punt for incense, establishing maritime routes that would remain important through Roman times and beyond. The sea that had risen to drown Ice Age settlements now facilitated the connections that would define classical civilization. Inland, rivers assumed their final courses, or at least courses stable enough to build around. The Nile's annual flood became predictable, the foundation for Egyptian agriculture and calendar. The Tigris and Euphrates settled into channels that Mesopotamian engineers could manage through increasingly sophisticated irrigation. The Indus River, fed by Himalayan snowmelt, provided reliable water for the Harappan civilization's precisely planned cities. These hydraulic civilizations, as historian Carl Wittfogel termed them, developed administrative complexity partially in response to managing water resources. Irrigation required coordination. Someone had to organize canal construction, maintain infrastructure, resolve disputes over water allocation. These practical needs generated bureaucracies, record-keeping systems, hierarchies of authority. The management of water resources became inseparable from the development of social complexity. But not all post-flood adaptation involved rivers and coasts. Inland populations developed different strategies. Pastoralism, herding domesticated animals across seasonal ranges, became refined into sophisticated systems. Nomadic peoples developed intricate knowledge of landscapes, water sources, grazing territories. They participated in trade networks, exchanging animal products for agricultural goods, maintaining relationships with settled societies that were sometimes cooperative, sometimes antagonistic, often both simultaneously. The Sahara's final desiccation, completed roughly during the same period, forced populations to choose. Many migrated to the Nile Valley, swelling Egypt's population and possibly accelerating its political unification. Others adapted to the emerging desert, developing camel pastoralism that would eventually support trans-Saharan trade routes. Still others may have moved southward, integrating into sub-Saharan African populations. carrying with them whatever cultural knowledge and technologies they developed during the Green Sahara period. Globally, the pattern repeated. Populations adapted to the post-glacial world by developing location-specific strategies-intensive agriculture where conditions permitted, pastoralism in marginal lands, maritime exploitation along coasts, hunter-gatherer persistence in regions where agriculture offered no advantage. The diversity of human subsistence strategies, visible in the ethnographic record, reflects adaptations to the stable but varied environments that emerged after the waters fell away. Cultural memory of earlier times persisted in myths, as discussed, but also possibly in less obvious forms. Did agricultural techniques developed during humid periods in regions now arid get preserved and later reapplied when conditions changed? Did populations returning to newly exposed coastlines carry knowledge from ancestors who fled rising seas generations earlier? Cultural continuity across environmental catastrophe is difficult to trace archaeologically, but oral traditions and conservative cultural practices can preserve information across remarkable time spans. The world after the flood, speaking mythologically, but also literally, became the world we recognize. The basic geography, the climatic patterns, the distribution of resources, the constraints and opportunities that shaped historical civilizations, all were established during this stabilization period. Everything that came after, the rise and fall of empires, the development of writing and mathematics and philosophy, the wars and treaties and artistic achievements unfolded in a world whose fundamental parameters had been set by Ice Age dynamics and post-glacial transformation. We live in that same world still. The coastlines we defend, the rivers we dam, the harbors we dredge all, exist in configurations established when our ancestors watched the waters finally stop rising. The stability we take for granted, the permanence we assume when we build cities on coasts and farms in floodplains, rests on geological accident, the temporary pause in climate dynamics that has persisted, so far, for 6,000 years. But so far is the operative phrase. Climate changes. Seas rise and fall. Ice sheets advance and retreat. The stability we've known is anomalous in geological terms, a brief intermission in ongoing planetary transformation. Our ancestors adapted to rising seas and desiccating landscapes. Their descendants, us, our children, their children, will adapt to whatever changes come next. The waters fell away, but they remember how to rise. Catalyuk, in central Anatolia, doesn't look like much from a distant, a mounded hill rising from agricultural plains, weathered and unremarkable. But beneath its surface lies something extraordinary, one of humanity's earliest experiments in urban living, dating to 7,500 BCE, 9,000 years ago. The settlement housed perhaps 8,000 people at its peak, living in densely packed mud brick structures accessed through roof openings rather than streets. There were no streets, in fact, the houses pressed directly against one another, forming a continuous mass broken only by the roof hatches and occasional courtyards. Residents walked across rooftops, descending ladders into their dwellings. The dead were buried beneath floors, literally incorporating ancestors into the architecture of daily life. This wasn't a city in the sense we typically use the term. No monumental architecture, no obvious administrative centers, no palaces or temples distinguishable from residential structures. Yet the concentration of people, the sustained habitation over more than 1,000 years, the evidence of craft specialization and long-distance trade all suggests something beyond simple village life. Catalyuk represents an early, perhaps experimental form of urban organization. The absence of obvious hierarchy intrigues archaeologists. Were these genuinely egalitarian societies, lacking rulers and pronounced social stratification? Or did power operate through mechanisms we don't recognize, religious authority, kinship systems, achieved rather than inherited status? The material record remains ambiguous, which itself tells us something. Not all complex societies expressed themselves through palaces and monuments. Meanwhile, in Mesopotamia, the Ubaid period was laying foundations for later Sumerian civilization. Small settlements clustered in the alluvial plains between the Tigris and Euphrates, taking advantage of the region's agricultural potential. These weren't yet cities, but were trending toward urban scale and complexity. Irrigation systems, pottery industries, trade networks, all the infrastructure that would support civilization was assembling, piece by piece, generation by generation. Uruk, when it emerged around 4000 BCE, represented a breakthrough. With populations potentially exceeding 40,000, it was unmistakably a city, the world's first true city, according to many archaeologists. Monumental architecture appeared: ziggurats, temples, administrative buildings. Writing developed here, initially as an accounting technology for tracking trade and storage, gradually expanding to encode language itself. Social hierarchy crystallized into visible form elite residences, craft specialization, occupational differentiation. What drove this transformation? Multiple factors likely contributed. Agricultural surplus allowed occupational specialization. Not everyone needed to produce food, so some could focus on crafts, administration, religious functions. Trade networks concentrated wealth and necessitated record-keeping, generating bureaucratic classes. Population density created coordination challenges, requiring new forms of organization. Competition between settlements may have driven increasing complexity as successful innovations spread while failures disappeared. But perhaps something else was also operating, something less tangible. The city as concept, as possibility, as solution to particular organizational challenges. Once proven successful at Uruk, the urban model spread. Other cities emerged throughout Mesopotamia, each developing variations on the theme, but sharing fundamental characteristics. The city became a template, replicated with modifications across regions and cultures. Egypt's urban trajectory differed. Rather than independent city-states, Egyptian civilization organized around a unified state with distributed urban centers subordinate to pharaonic authority. Memphis, founded around 2925 BCE as the capital of unified Egypt, functioned as an administrative and ceremonial center rather than an independent polity. The Nile itself served many coordination functions that cities provided elsewhere: transportation, communication, trade infrastructure. Egyptian urbanism was extensive, but less concentrated than Mesopotamian models. The Indus Valley developed yet another urban pattern. Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, flourishing around 2500 BCE, show remarkable planning grid layouts. Sophisticated drainage systems, standardized brick sizes, public buildings. Yet they lack monumental temples or palaces. Religious and political power, if centralized, expressed itself differently than in Mesopotamia or Egypt. The Indus cities remained enigmatic, their script undeciphered, their collapse poorly understood, their achievements impressive but frustratingly opaque. China's earliest cities emerged along the Yellow River around 1900 BCE, though earlier settlements with proto-urban characteristics existed. The Erlitou culture built large palatial compounds, developed bronze metallurgy, created complex societies that would eventually crystallize into the Shang dynasty. Chinese urbanism, like Egyptian, was embedded within larger state structures rather than existing as independent city-states. Each regional tradition developed urban forms suited to local conditions, available resources, existing social structures. Mesopotamia's flat alluvial plains and lack of stone encouraged mud brick construction and compact urban forms. Egypt's stone availability and linear geography along the Nile influenced its dispersed urban pattern. The Indus cities' grid plans suggest strong central planning. Chinese cities' walled compounds reflected hierarchical social organization, but all shared certain characteristics. Dense populations, urban concentrations contrasting with rural hinterlands. Occupational specialization: potters, smiths, merchants, priests, administrators. Monumental architecture, whether temples, palaces, or public works. Writing or proto-writing systems. Trade networks extending beyond local regions. Social hierarchies with visible material correlates. The city represented a new mode of human organization, as significant a transformation as the agricultural revolution that preceded it. In cities, strangers lived in close proximity. Traditional kinship-based organization became inadequate for coordinating thousands of unrelated individuals. New forms of social control emerged: law codes, professional administrators, military forces. The city necessitated and enabled complexity impossible in smaller-scale societies. Yet early cities were fragile. Uruk, Eridu, these Mesopotamian cities rose and fell, sometimes repeatedly. Environmental degradation from overuse of irrigation led to salinization and crop failures. Climate shifts disrupted agricultural systems. Warfare destroyed and displaced populations. The archaeological record shows cycles of growth and collapse, with sites sometimes abandoned for centuries before reoccupation. The first cities were experiments, not all of them successful. For every Uruk that thrived, others failed abandoned when water sources shifted, when trade routes changed, when diseases decimated populations, when administrative systems proved inadequate. The cities that survived, whose names echo through history, represent survival bias. We remember successes while forgetting the countless attempts that failed, leaving only mounded ruins and scattered artifacts. These cities of silence, some literally abandoned, others transformed beyond recognition, pioneered the urban lifestyle that now dominates human existence. More than half of humanity currently lives in cities, a proportion that continues growing. The trajectory begun at Catalhuyuk and Uruk reached its apotheosis in modern megacities, housing tens of millions. But the same vulnerabilities persist. Cities concentrate people and resources, creating efficiency but also fragility. Supply chain disruptions, water shortages, disease, social unrest all threaten urban systems just as they threatened ancient Mesopotamian cities. The scale has changed, the technologies have advanced, but fundamental dependencies remain. Cities are magnificent achievements and precarious gambles simultaneously. The first cities of silence speak, if we listen, about ambition and limitation, triumph and failure, the heights humanity can reach and the depths to which we can fall. They remind us that nothing built lasts forever unchanged, that every civilization plants seeds of its own transformation, that silence eventually claims even the loudest metropolis. But for a time, centuries, millennia, they blazed with life, with commerce and conflict, art and industry, suffering and celebration. They were cauldrons of human potential, forging the technologies and social forms that would shape everything to come. They were, quite literally, where civilization was invented. And now they sleep, mostly excavated, studied, partially reconstructed for tourists, or still buried beneath modern cities. The silence is profound. But it's the silence of completed stories, not of stories that never occurred. The cities spoke. Their echoes reach us still. The archaeological record is incomplete. This isn't controversial. Every archaeologist acknowledges it. Sites erode, artifacts decay, locations remain undiscovered. What we know about the past represents a tiny fraction of what actually occurred. The question is, how incomplete? Are we missing details, nuances, individual sites? Or are we missing entire civilizations, whole chapters of human history that left insufficient traces for recovery? Consider the requirements for archaeological visibility. A culture needs to build with durable materials: stone, fired clay, metal. It needs to occupy sites long enough to generate thick archaeological deposits. Its material culture needs distinctive characteristics allowing identification. Ideally, it develops writing, providing direct information about language, beliefs, organization. And crucially, its sites need to remain accessible, not buried under cities, drowned beneath seas, or otherwise rendered inaccessible. Many societies fail one or more of these criteria. Nomadic peoples leave sparse archaeological traces, portable possessions, ephemeral camps, little to distinguish one group from another. Cultures building primarily with wood, working with organic materials, or occupying sites briefly might leave almost nothing recognizable millennia later. Societies developing in regions now underwater, buried under alluvial deposits, or covered by expanding deserts, could be essentially invisible to standard archaeological methods. The Green Sahara civilizations discussed earlier exemplify this. We know people occupied the region during humid periods. The rock art proves it, scattered artifacts confirm it. But the scale, complexity, and achievements of these societies remain largely unknown because desert conditions destroyed organic materials and buried sites under dunes. What if sophisticated cultures arose during the 6,000-year humid period? What if population centers existed that we simply haven't found because they're buried under meters of sand in regions rarely surveyed? Underwater archaeology faces similar challenges. The continental shelves exposed during glacial periods, now submerged, would have been prime real estate for coastal settlements. Population densities along Ice Age coasts probably exceeded those of interior regions. Yet these areas are now beneath up to 120 meters of water, often covered by marine sediments, accessible only through expensive underwater surveys in waters that are frequently dark, cold, and dangerous. A few underwater sites have been discovered accidentally, usually by fishermen, oil exploration, or amateur divers. But systematic survey of submerged landscapes remains rare. The technology exists underwater remotely operated vehicles, submarine archaeology, side-scan sonar, but the effort required to survey even small areas is enormous. The vast majority of drowned continental shelf remains unexplored. What lies there? Probably mostly mundane sites, fishing camps, villages, nothing particularly dramatic, but possibly more. If coastal populations during glacial periods achieved complexity comparable to later inland societies, evidence would now lie underwater. Ports, trading centers, ritual sites all drowned when seas rose, waiting in darkness for technologies and funding sufficient to find and study them. Similar reasoning applies to regions buried under alluvial deposits. Major river systems continuously deposit sediments, gradually raising floodplain elevations. Ancient sites near rivers can end up buried under meters of later deposits. The deeper you dig, the older the materials, but at some point, excavation becomes impractical. Archaeological investigation typically explores the uppermost meters. Earlier occupations, if they exist, remain inaccessible beneath water tables, beneath modern structures, beneath sedimentary layers too thick to reasonably excavate. Some archaeological traditions may be invisible for cultural reasons. If a society deliberately avoided leaving permanent traces, practiced nomadism, or developed sophisticated technologies from organic materials, it could achieve considerable complexity while remaining nearly invisible archaeologically. Native American societies of the Pacific Northwest developed complex social hierarchies, impressive artistic traditions, and sophisticated resource management while building primarily with wood and working with organic materials. Their achievements are known through ethnography and oral tradition, but would be difficult to reconstruct from archaeology alone if all contemporary knowledge were lost. Controversial researchers propose more provocative scenarios. What if advanced civilizations, not modern advanced, but sophisticated relative to their eras, arose and fell during periods poorly represented in our archaeological record? What if cataclysmic events, asteroid impacts, supervolcanic eruptions, rapid climate shifts periodically reset human cultural development, destroying civilizations and forcing survivors to rebuild from reduced technological bases? The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis represents one such proposal. Around 12,800 years ago, Earth's climate was warming, ice sheets were retreating, and human populations were expanding. Then, abruptly, temperatures plummeted. The Younger Dryas cold period lasted roughly 1,200 years before ending equally abruptly. The cause remains debated, but some researchers propose an extraterrestrial impact, a comet or asteroid fragmenting in the atmosphere, triggering wildfires, climate disruption, and megafaunal extinctions. If such an impact occurred, it might have disrupted human societies across multiple continents. Populations that had been growing in developing complexity could have crashed. Technologies could have been lost. Survivors would have faced environmental chaos, forcing focus on immediate survival rather than cultural elaboration. Recovery would take generations or centuries. The archaeological evidence of pre-impact developments might be sparse, disrupted, difficult to interpret. Mainstream archaeology remains skeptical of the Younger Dryas impact. Hypothesis the evidence is debated and alternative explanations exist. But the scenario illustrates how ghost civilizations could theoretically exist. A society achieving moderate complexity during a period of favorable climate could be disrupted by catastrophe, leaving only fragmentary traces easily missed or misinterpreted by later archaeologists. The historical record provides examples of forgotten civilizations, though not on the timescales required for these more speculative scenarios. The Hittite Empire, a major Bronze Age power that competed with Egypt and dominated Anatolia, was entirely forgotten by later classical civilization. Their existence was unknown until archaeological excavations in the 19th century revealed their cities and deciphered their languages. For thousands of years, a major civilization that had profoundly influenced regional history was completely lost to memory. If the Hittites could be forgotten, despite their impressive material remains and proximity to well-documented cultures, what else might have been lost? Societies that thrived in regions less well explored, that used less durable materials, that were disrupted more thoroughly, that left fewer traces. These could remain undiscovered indefinitely. The Göbekli Tepe example is sobering. This massive ceremonial complex, built by supposedly simple hunter-gatherers 11,000 years ago, was unknown until 1994. It overturned assumptions about what pre-agricultural societies could achieve. How many other sites remain undiscovered, buried under hills considered unremarkable, located in regions not yet surveyed? The ghost civilizations, if they exist, remain between the lines implied by gaps in the record, hinted at by anomalies, suggested by the sheer scope of what we haven't yet explored. They haunt the margins of archaeology, neither confirmed nor definitively ruled out. Possibilities that remind us how much we don't know. Perhaps there are no ghost civilizations. Perhaps the record, while incomplete, captures the essential trajectory of human development. Early simplicity gradually yielding to complexity, punctuated by regional developments but following generally predictable patterns. This is the conservative, well-supported position. But perhaps, between the known civilizations, in the gaps of the record, in regions we haven't properly explored or can't easily access, other stories wait. Stories of peoples who rose and fell, leaving barely a trace. Stories of achievements lost when environments transformed. Stories of knowledge preserved only in myths now dismissed as fantasy. The desert keeps secrets. The sea keeps secrets. The earth itself, patient and silent, keeps secrets beneath our feet. Some will eventually be revealed as techniques improve and exploration continues. Others may remain forever hidden, their stories lost to the same forces that destroyed the civilizations themselves. The ghost civilizations haunt us, not because we know they exist, but because we know we can't prove they don't. In the shadows of what we know lies everything we don, a vast territory of possibility where lost worlds wait, silent and invisible, between the lines of history we thought we'd written. In a dusty museum drawer, preserved in climate-controlled conditions, rests a small clay tablet covered in cuneiform script. It's not a royal proclamation, not a religious text, not a literary masterpiece. It's an inventory, a merchant's record of goods received, quantities tallied, transactions completed. It documents commercial exchanges so mundane that probably no one at the time considered them worth preserving for posterity. Yet this humble tablet survived for over 4,000 years. The merchant who incised it, the customers whose transactions it recorded, the cities they inhabited, the language they spoke, the gods they worshipped, all vanished utterly. The civilization that created the context for this commercial exchange collapsed, was conquered, was absorbed, was forgotten. But the shopping list remained. Clay tablets represent humanity's most durable records. Fire doesn't destroy them, it actually strengthens them, making them harder. Water can damage them if they're not fired, but burial in dry conditions preserves them indefinitely. They're too low value to loot, too mundane to deliberately destroy, too numerous to entirely eliminate. So they persist, cataloging the quotidian details that prestigious monuments and literary texts ignore. We know more about daily life in ancient Mesopotamia than in many later civilizations precisely because of these humble tablets. What people ate, how much things cost, who owed whom money, which temples received which offerings, all documented in vast archives of clay. The administrative minutiae, the economic transactions, the legal disputes, all preserved in script that waited thousands of years for someone to relearn how to read it. The contrast with monumental architecture is striking. Palaces fall, temples crumble. The great ziggurat of Ur, meant to elevate kings toward gods, is now a melted ruin, impressive still, but fragmentary. The walls that defended cities breached and collapsed. The statues of kings who considered themselves eternal broke and scattered. But the merchant's inventory, the student's practice tablet, the bureaucrat's report, these survived, tucked away in forgotten rooms, buried beneath collapsing walls, preserved by accident rather than intention. Other mundane objects show similar longevity. Pottery shards thousands of years old. Billions of fragments litter archaeological sites worldwide. Each one is a small miracle of preservation, a fragment of someone's daily routine. That pot was made by hands, used for storage or cooking or serving, eventually broken, discarded, forgotten. Its maker never imagined it would be excavated, analyzed, dated, cataloged, and stored in a museum archive thousands of years later. Roman graffiti survives in Pompeii political slogans, insults, declarations of love, advertisements for gladiatorial games. The words were scratched casually onto walls by people who assumed the messages had a useful life measured in days or weeks. Then Vesuvius erupted, burying the city in ash, preserving everything in a catastrophic moment of petrification. Now tourists read millennia-old advertisements for events that never occurred because everyone died before the scheduled dates. The accidental nature of preservation is humbling. The things we intend to preserve, monuments, masterpieces, carefully maintained archives, often decay despite our efforts. Meanwhile, trash heaps and collapsed buildings protect casual detritus that no one meant to save. The archaeological record is biased not toward what was valued, but toward what happened to survive, a product of material durability, deposition context, and sheer luck. This creates interesting paradoxes. We know intimate details about ancient commercial transactions, but can only speculate about religious beliefs. We can reconstruct daily diets, but barely understand political organization. The shopping lists survived. The constitutions didn't. The inventory records remain legible. The epic poetry was forgotten before anyone thought to write it down. The mundane outlasting the monumental provides a particular lens on impermanence. The kings who raised palaces and commissioned statues believed, presumably, that their names would echo through eternity. The monuments were designed for permanence, built to impress and endure. Yet many are now rubble, their inscriptions weathered illegible, their meanings forgotten. Meanwhile, some anonymous scribes' routine documentation created with no thought of posterity, describing transactions considered utterly ordinary survived to provide modern scholars with invaluable data about ancient economics, social relationships, and daily life. The scribe has no name. The merchant is unknown. The customers are anonymous. But their transaction persists, outliving every king, every priest, every warrior whose names were once famous. There's a lesson here about value and permanence. What we consider important, what we invest effort in preserving, what we build monuments to commemorate, these may not endure as we expect. Meanwhile, the unglamorous, the quotidian, the mundane, these sometimes persist simply by being numerous, distributed, and beneath notice. The shopping list that outlived a civilization reminds us that grandeur is fragile. Empires fall, languages die, religions transform beyond recognition. But the humble clay tablet, recording 2 kilograms of barley received in exchange for 3 wool garments, survives a fragment of reality preserved in mundane detail, testimony that ordinary people lived ordinary lives, struggled with ordinary concerns, and left traces that outlasted everything their rulers built to achieve immortality. In the end, it's not the monuments, but the minutiae that preserve the past most faithfully. The shopping lists, the pottery shards, the trash heaps, the casual graffiti, these tell us who people actually were, how they actually lived, what actually mattered in daily existence. The rest is myth, aspiration, propaganda, important in their own ways, but less reliably preserved than the merchant's inventory and the potter's broken jar. 4,000 years from now, what of our civilization will survive? The monuments, carefully preserved in museums? Or the ubiquitous plastic, the electronic waste, the mountains of disposable products that characterize our era? Probably the latter. Future archaeologists will excavate our garbage, reconstruct our daily lives from what we threw away, analyze our shopping lists, digital and otherwise, to understand what we valued, how we lived, what we consumed. The monumental may not survive, but the mundane, the humble, durable, numerous detritus of daily life will remain, telling future millennia more about us than we probably prefer. The shopping list, once again, will outlive the civilization.